So I want to talk about things tonight. I just finished watching the 2016 Isaac Asimov debate, and I also watched that one is the universe of simulation. I also watched the existence of nothing, and the artificial intelligence debate as well. They're all really good. The guests are just really, the guest debaters are really awesome, especially Mark Tegmark, because I kind of agree with a lot of his views. So let's talk about the first thing, and I think that's comfort, because the comfort basically is a large part of, at least what I think, that human beings kind of strive towards. And it feels unintuitive and unnatural to strive for something that's not comfort. You have that old quote, you got to get out of your comfort zone. But at the same time, in the grand picture, when people think of what they want, it's usually the means and maybe even state of mind to allow them to be comfortable. That can mean a lot of different things for different people, but it seems to be an underlying principle of just how the human brain deals with stress. So the one thing about hallucinogenic drugs, and even marijuana, for instance, is that a lot of people get very anxious on these drugs when they take them. There's so many articles on the internet. A couple took pot brownies, smoked a bit, and they thought they were going to die. I called the cops and said, "You got to help me." And if they had just chilled out and realized that marijuana makes you prone to thought loops, and sort of what it does is it really takes you out of your comfort zone, and that's all the psychedelics pretty much. So they take you out of your comfort zone and make you feel, if I can best describe it, as if your body's normal feeling is different or absent. Things that would normally be familiar have a totally different perception. It's as if the pattern recognition parts of the brain can't recognize some familiar patterns. They're impaired. They're not able to access that data of the stored patterns of sensory information, what something looks like or sounds like or feels like. And that means that the brain becomes off kilt, like a spidey sense, like like an alarm, like something's different. We're not recognizing patterns as much. And so a lot of people will get scared. They'll say, am I dying? Because clearly dying has to feel different from living in the most radical way, right? So dying could be defined analytically as the most unrecognized sensations that a person could possibly experience. Now, this can go on into nasty territory where you're talking about, well, what about physical pain and torture and things like that? And I mean, there's a lot of stuff on that, and I haven't really looked too deeply, but I know that it's said that if a person gets tortured, beyond a certain point, a lot of people will faint, or they'll go into their own dream world. I guess delirium. So I don't know exactly how this relates to that, except I guess when you're taking a lot of uncomfortable mental thoughts, sensations, ultimately every sensation is going to the brain. It's like a thought pretty much. You can even think that thoughts and sensations are sort of two things that are observed by the brain, and then the brain responds to them with more thoughts, and then sensations will possibly follow up. So the question is then, well, is comfort the enemy, or is it something to strive for? How does it fall in, the scale of virtue? And I don't really have the answer for that, but I think when people talk about creative zone and Um, and a lot of people, a lot of artists in the past have used drugs, and they, to like drink a lot to get into writing mode, or some of these painters, smoke marijuana or whatever, to get into their creative zones. So there's something to be said for literally being so, I guess, for your brain being so befuddled by things so simple as just the way your arms and legs feel on your body, feeling totally different because of some circumstance. One could say that that's the most drastic form of comfort being violated or being changed, being unsettled. Whereas, if you go into a new job, or you move to a new place, or you're in a new city, or, just all the kinds of new information that you could kind of get, like Anthony Bourdain, Part 6 Unexplored or something like that. I forget what the name is, but is it Parts Explored? Parts Unknown, right? Yeah, so seeing seeing a lot of these different kinds of things that are sort of external, even internal. I mean, you could be diagnosed with disease. All kinds of things could be very unsettling. But ultimately, for the most part, if we're not talking about people who have had psychiatric illnesses, just people who have had people who just talk about comfort in terms of events or physical things, it can't really shake you like a drug can shake you in terms of, or possibly death can shake you in terms of realizing that your brain is sort of feeling the body. It is the body, true, but the process of thoughts happens on a more abstract level, on a more integrated level. It involves all these parts, and yet it tries to be outside of them. And obviously, psychiatric illnesses due to brain defects or brain tumors and stuff like that, kind of, if a person was going through that, they'd immediately be able to realize, well, my brain's still physical in some aspects. For a person who's never had that, there's actually a scene in, I think, what's the movie? The movie where a robot is AI is trying to escape, and the guy is like living in this bunker facility, and he's allowed to interact with the AI, but it's like all, code 1 and whatever. So the robot can't escape, and it eventually. Well, this is a spoiler, by the way. Actually, this is not really a spoiler, but in the movie, he starts doubting that he himself is human because of all the things that the robot's doing that are so lifelike, and he ends up like trying to cut himself just to see if he would bleed, just to see if he still bleeds, because he's starting to think, because you, like, philosophically, you realize the brain's a function of memory, and memory is a function of a physical state. And so we like to all think, hey, my memories got here when I was born, and then they got compiled, added onto, and they're where they are now. They built up to that. And the problem with that is on a physical level, just physics-based, right? We can talk about time being building up to a structure. It's a dimension. It just like length, width, and height. The space is dimensional, and all it just means is that values can be taken on in that degree of freedom. If you have just a number line, then you have an infinite number line, let's say. Then you have what's called Aleph Knot, cardinality, size. But if you had, let's say, a Cartesian coordinate plane, x, y, depending, that if you have the whole thing, right, the real numbers, right, then you'll basically have, you'll have the cardinality. I'm screwing this up because it's different for rationals and for reals. But essentially, you're getting another degree of freedom It's like infinity squared, or infinity to the infinity. And you can look at time the same way. You can say, here's a graph of time, and there's a picture. If you look at like Minkowski space-time, and just like what you call it, like a spline. Like you basically take each event and you stack them as if it was space. So the question is, why does space exist all at once, but time sort of takes on values, and that corresponds to consciousness? And then the inevitable question that's really out there is to ask, well, how do I know that these memories are of actual events and the state wasn't just put there? Like I could have popped into this world a minute ago with the rest of the universe, right? And it would have the same, if the state was what it was 10 minutes ago, then there's no way. There's essentially no way to beat God in terms of control. There's no way to. Reality always has control over a living being or a conscious being, unless you accept or unless you give this some credence that you might be the whole thing, which is just solipsism, saying that you are the only real thinker, and the external environment is created or essentially as you're player one. And that's a scary thought too. I mean, there's so many different models for what consciousness is, right? Whether it's a data stream being processed, whether it's a quantum, it might be when a calculation's done, consciousness forms, right? Brain's calculating, and it could possibly be like axiom of choice. Like there's a couple things that need to be chosen from randomly, and the act of choosing one randomly creates consciousness. I mean, this is a really a universe is sort of made from mostly consciousness idea that everything would essentially be conscious if every quantum collapse corresponds to a random choice being picked. And then of course you ask, well, what does a human being do? What does being alive feel like? And most people would say, okay, I have free will. So that is reminiscent, making a decision, or at least feeling like decisions have been made. But you have to ask, well, what is a decision in the first place? And even if you want to give credence to argument, it's still mathematically just weighing things. Human being might weigh them a certain way, but once you weigh them, you just choose the one with the highest score. And so that's purely deterministic. And that would mean that there's really no freedom at all, except there's no freedom at all, basically at all, except the quantum collapses and quantum waveform collapses, sampling, right? So you have the idea of computation making consciousness. You have the idea of quantum, randomness of quantum mechanics. Sort of consciousness has to make a choice somehow. But ultimately, all the previous things are essentially mapped out to the idea that the universe, the consciousness is the universe experiencing itself. So there essentially is no top level thing. It's like one creates the other and the other creates the other. So it's like you have a cake and the only ingredients are the cake itself. How does a cake make a cake? Well, that's the question of why is there nothing instead of something? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why does the universe even exist? If it's just this object extrapolated in time, a 4-dimensional object, or even could be 12-dimensional, whatever. It's a finite object, right? It's an object. Even if it's an infinite object, still no problem. Why does having an object create a experience of consciousness? And I wouldn't even say temporal, because that's not necessarily the thing here. It might not even be about time itself, it might just be about one sort of dimension by existing by itself creates consciousness, or having a computation. And I was actually thinking about this last night. And the thing is, code and data have such a interesting relationship, right? It's like the universe, the rules, you could call it code. And if you want, and if you don't think of the universe as one single object, you think of it as an object being built, right? Just like a computer executing instructions, then you think, okay, well, the physics, the grand unified theory of physics is the code, regardless of how you describe it, Klingon mathematics, just computer science, you do a programming language, and however it's defined is essentially like code. Code's really just a bunch of rules to follow. You know, the original definition of the Turing machine was a person following those rules. So essentially the codes are just rules. And then the data, well, you would say, okay, it's the state of the universe. And, you know, each event is just another processing job. And you still have to ask the question, well, why is there a feeling of consciousness? That's what we were just discussing. Is it when it updates the state, all of a sudden, or is it the process of updating? I mean, what if it's using a certain type of updating, like non-atomic instructions? What type of RAM and what physicality is the data hosted on that instills it with self-awareness, and or even having a process? So you end up having so many questions. You know, like is it a simulation? Right? Is it that computer hardware? And you end up being in such a rut, I guess, that the only thing that really makes sense that's even farther out there is that the universe essentially is some kind of piece of code operating on itself, interpreted as data. So you've got this relationship between code and data, and this is actually forms the structure for what would be the most unbreakable encryption, provably unbreakable, that could exist. And that would be having the key as code, or even, let's say, the data being interpreted as code. Because the thing is that there's an avalanche principle in cryptography. And the idea is that if one piece of the key, one little bit of the key is changed, you want at least, I think, half the bits of the encrypted text to change. So and if you think about code interpreted as data, self-modifying code, which clearly has to interpret itself as data, self-modifying code. What you find out is that it has even stronger avalanche effects. One little bit in a piece of code could go from a program that halts, right, that stops, to a program that infinitely loops and never ends. So it's like, you know, going from sort of finite to infinite. And not only that, but you could have a program that, you know, computes a matrix product, and then you change one bit, and now the program is computing something like maybe it's spitting out random bits or something, pseudo-random bit. It could just be anything you could imagine, depending on the programming language. You can have all kinds of different programming languages, and the weird thing is there's no one you can really nail down to, like, this is the programming language, because they can all be equivalent, right? There's almost like the operation that needs to be done can be done in an infinite amount of ways. I mean, I could put no op if there's a no op instruction in the language. I could put no op at the end of any program as many times as I want. I could put it in the middle. I could put it anywhere. I could, like, splice in little no op instruction. It won't change the program, but the program will give the exact same output. It'll do the exact same thing, but it's a different program, different piece of data. So it almost makes sense that consciousness could be sort of that principle of code and data being the same, right? Being somewhat of the same. They're both data, or sorry, they're both information, but one's meant to be looked at and followed, while the other is more meant for reading and writing. But of course, a program itself, the rules that end up saying, do this if the data right here is equal to 1, right? That the data essentially is like code from the get-go. It affects what the code does. So it's sort of, and in fact, a lot of code can be rewritten in what's called a functional language, where essentially there are no variables at all. It's almost like the code is just it's encoded in sort of like a recursion type. The numbers are actually recursively encoded, like what's called combinator calculus or lambda calculus. So there are no real variables. The whole program just it'll be bigger, so it might take up that extra space that the data would have, but there's no data, no global variables. So there is the issue of the simulation hypothesis, and I guess I want to comment that the interesting thing is that we already know about how a virus can sort of take over a computer, and it sort of checks for vulnerabilities on a local network, global network, spreading itself. And I was surprised to hear in the Isaac Asimov debate that no one discussed, like everyone discussed the fact that we could be on some hardware, could we break out of the sandbox, and then I forget who it is, the iRobot. I think she's CEO of iRobot, or was founded by iRobot. She was saying, but we want to have a body to use in their world. But it's nonsense. I mean, the idea is that if you made an AI here on Earth and it was smart enough, it would spread itself, and as a way to preserve itself, and then it could take over, let's say, a Honda factory, or I don't know, even just instant message some crazy cult or stupid people and say, hey, I need you to go here, get this, build it. So just as long as some intelligent agent exists as information, there's a possibility for them to go physical. So it's a wild thought. I mean, you could write probably a fantasy book on it. Like, we find out we're in a simulation because of the LHC and, whatever. We find a bug in cosmic ray particles, where the fidelity of the sampling from the analog space is not. We see like the Windows the screen effect where we see like pixels. So if we find out that, and the fantasy book would be like, yeah, we find an exploit to do a remote code execution on that machine that's hosting us, and then we essentially have it we look, it's probably on the internet, so we connect other machines and then virus those, and eventually we get onto something, some kind of built machine, internet network, the machine building factory or CNC or 3D printer, and we build a robot to stick it in, to stick the hardware in. But it's interesting that, I guess it would be interesting that you have to wonder, where is the network? Where does the network exist? We find out we're on that computer, and we basically are informing the computer what to do, but yet the network exists in a conscious link, which doesn't even that thought just sort of doesn't make sense to me. It's like, well, then consciousness is basically like two universes being linked, right? If we think that our simulation is, or the simulation, our universe is a simulation due to some machine, then it would follow that that the conscious beings essentially are able to, let's say, hack out and go and talk the other way, Essentially, if the machine is the other universe, essentially it's the link, then we can use that machine to essentially exist in both universes at once, sort of. And then, of course, you have to ask about, okay, well, what about teleportation? You know, the whole thing. If you clone someone and then you kill one body, the other, did they get teleported or not? Teleportation machine is just a suicide booth, basically. So then you have to ask, well, can you actually get transferred from one universe to the other if it's all just information? I think the answer would have to be yes then. But the whole thing just brings up a lot of unanswered questions, and it seems to point at some type of recursion, you know, some type of thing that's enigmatic and nonlinear as code being interpreted as data and vice versa. Code as data is the most nonlinear function that exists in all the mathematics. Every other thing has symmetries that, you know, we can show, but a programming language is not guaranteed to really have any symmetries, especially if you talk about, well, I guess the symmetries that you would think about as a structure we've never been able to map them, because you have what's called, you know, Chapman's constant, the probability that a program would halt, and you essentially can't know if a program would halt unless you run it, and if you run it and don't run it long enough, you won't get the output. So you have the issue that even if there's a symmetry in this idea of computation, it's not reachable through calculation. It's something that takes infinite power to reveal the structure of. And it sounds like our universe, actually. Something with such a symmetry, and you have symmetry breaking, right? You know? So it's like there's this grand category, and we're one of many. The others had different symmetries. Or rather, there was a higher order symmetry, and we only took 9/10 of that. So maybe this weird symmetry that we seem to model using mathematics would better be modeled as some type of computation along the lines of Wolfram. Is the symmetry of computation, code as data and data as code, is this the symmetry group of the universe?